Mr. McTier has been at the heart of an awful lot of what's shaped modern Atlanta, and we just wanted to get a chance to talk about that a little bit.
Among the older members, we might say.
Well, we've had some grand conversations with Cecil Alexander.
Oh, yes.
I worked with him more than 40 years ago when I first came to Atlanta as a grad student. So.
Right. And one of those people that really does care about the community. Invested himself, and certainly from a business standpoint, interested in that manner, but also interested well beyond that in terms of all of the elements of what makes the community healthy.
Are you from Atlanta?
I'm from Georgia. My father was a Methodist minister, and I was born in Columbus, and then we lived in several different towns in South Georgia. And then I went back to Columbus, and where my father was district superintendent of the Columbus district of the Methodist Church, and I went to high school in Columbus, and then I came from Columbus to Atlanta to go to Emory in 1957.
Okay.
And I essentially left Columbus and started living in Atlanta fully at that time, because I essentially went through Emory, straight through, going summers and working also. And then my parents moved away from Columbus to another community, another church to serve. And so I've been in Atlanta since 1957.
You've seen enormous changes in that length of time.
And I would say, as we and others I'm sure have reflected back on, at that time Atlanta was not greatly distinguishable from Birmingham, Nashville, other southern communities. It was really, in the late 50s and the 60s that the surge of growth and all of the events occurred that made it the larger and perhaps more distinguished community that it is.
How would you describe Atlanta in the late 50s, early 60s in terms of your experience of it? We've talked with many folks, white and black, who've talked about a segregated Atlanta in those days.
Well, it certainly was a segregated community in terms of where people went to school, where they lived in large measure, how they went about their business, so to speak. There was a very distinctive black business community, and then you had, of course, the white community, and had organizations like the Commerce Club formed, which was a sort of a center point for the white business community, and we all saw how that changed as the community changed, how the Commerce Club became integrated, and the leadership began to be shared in that kind of institution. But no, I came when things were still largely, and I remember I was in high school, and for some reason I had to be in the principal's office, not for a disciplinary matter, but for some other matter. And I remember the newspaper and the headline, Brown versus Board of Education. And there was, in my latter stages of high school, that event took place, and that was one of the kickoff points for things beginning to change as far as integration of our communities. And no, I had, as I had grown up in the southern part of the state, where you really had essentially two separate communities, there was the Caucasian and the African American, and all that went with that. So that's what I grew up with, and I grew up in a minister's home who had to confront a lot of this, but I would not say my father was, an evangelist, for change, but he was certainly a person who did have a commitment to sound Christian values, which did include concern for everybody and mission outreach to those that were less fortunate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of challenging the, order that was in place, the laws that were on the book, whatever it was not directly confronted there. But I do remember later on when he was pastor of the First Methodist Church of Fort Valley in Fort Valley State, and this was during the time of the civil rights activity. And there were members of the church says, well, if the students come and to the service, we'll just halt the service. And the administrator, Dad said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to go on with our service. And he prevailed. Mm-hmm. And so I was very proud of him for that, where he was, confronting mm-hmm. the traditions very, very directly. Now I'll say that we moved the next year, but I don't know that, because, and I'll say this, that I ran into someone this past spring who was from Fort Valley and knew about that and was there, and it was the first time that somebody had said we were very lucky to have your father there at the time, because he was the statesman that the church needed to have to address the issue. So but I did grow up in that traditional South of that, born in 1939, and so I understand the full picture of how things were then, and then because of what occurred later, have understood the changes that have occurred, particularly in Atlanta, of course, because that's where I have been. And I've been here since 1957, and will make it Atlanta my home for the rest of my life. And so I have that perspective.
So how did you come to be at Emory? Was it because of the Methodist connection?
The Methodist connection had a lot to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
Got a discount if it did go. And the only institution I applied to were Methodist-related institutions. And I never felt a calling to be a minister, but the church was very important in our lives. And my brother had gone to Emory, undergraduate, and to law school. My father had graduated from the theology school. My sister had taken some art courses there, and my older brother had spent a little time at Emory at Oxford. So we knew Emory, and it was principally through the brother who went, through undergraduate and law school that did so well. And he was 5 years my senior, so he pretty well completed his work by the time that I came, and so that was of some influence to his recent experience. But the real choice that I was making, big school, little school, and I decided to just come on and try Emory, and I did, and I, as I say, went right on through. I pretty much worked my way through school, although my parents were going to make the sacrifice to pay, but I knew that this was a big sacrifice that they would be making. Even with the discount, there was still considerable, because I'm not sure that Dad's salary was never very significant. We always had station in the community. We always were let's call it at the forefront of the community, but we never had a lot of monetary benefit. So anyway, I started to work my sophomore year and then paid my way for the rest of the time. So a lot of my experience in college was work related, sold clothes at a Emory men's shop, and then I became a policeman. Emory had its own security force, but they were DeKalb County policemen. So when I was 19, no, I guess it was 20, they had one student who worked part-time, and I became that student. And my first day, they took me to DeKalb County Police Headquarters. I was sworn in, gave me a badge. I came back, put it on my uniform. They gave me a gun, and I went to work that night. And I had no training whatsoever. Fortunately, I got through it without hurting myself or anybody else. So that gave me, because we were on the weekends. I would relieve the full-time officers in the one police car that we had, and I was the only, and whoever was on duty on the weekends was the only policeman on the Emory campus. Now you probably got scores of them around there because things have changed. But we answered county calls and were involved in the larger community. So that was another way that I saw the community and around me, the university on the one hand, and then the larger community as well. So it was not like that I was sort of entombed at the university. I was in a situation where I had direct experience with the community around the university.
So how did you come to work with Woodruff?
All right, I completed my studies at Emory, and when I graduated, there was a position open in Emory University Hospital for an assistant administrator. And because of my work with the university, people knew who I was, and I was given the opportunity to take that position. There were several assistant administrators, and I was selected as one. My main job was to make sure we knew how the bills were going to be paid when patients came in and when they left. And it was patient affairs. Anyway, I did that for a couple of years, and then I was invited to be business manager of the Department of Psychiatry at Emory at a time when the department was in transition from a volunteer faculty of psychiatrists who practiced in Atlanta and going out there and teaching to one where you had a full-time. And Dr. Bernard Holland had been brought from Columbia University by Emory to head up the department and to build a full-time faculty department. And he did a good job at it in a very short period of time, but he needs somebody to help him in the business of running the department. It was also the time when the Georgia Mental Health Institute was opening up on Briarcliff Road, and it was to be the place where mental health personnel were trained to staff community mental health centers that were going to be established around the country. President Kennedy had that concept, and I think President Johnson did too, of having community health delivered more closely to the home of the individual rather than having them institutionalized. Something that really was never realized in terms because of the lack of federal investment. So I was business manager part of psychiatry for 3 years, and then I became associate director of personnel, human resources they call it now, and I did that for 3 years, and my principal job there was to be concerned about the hiring and retaining of people in the medical area, not faculty and not major administrators, but the staffing. And I was wage and salary administrator. Did that for 3 years, and then I was invited to become assistant to the president and assistant to the board of trustees. And then that was, I had then the sort of perspective of everything that was going on in the university at the governing level. But it also introduced me to Beaufort A. Jones, whose picture you see right behind you there, who was in 1972, he was made president of the Emily and Ernest Woodruff Foundation, the Trebor Foundation, which was Robert spelled backwards, and then 3 Whitehead foundations, Joseph B. Whitehead, Lady Pate Evans, and the Lady Pate Whitehead foundations. 3 Whitehead family foundations had been administered separately, and the Emily and Ernest Woodruff Foundation had been administered separately, and the Trebor Foundation had been administered separately. And they were all brought together by their boards, of which Mr. Woodruff was an influential member, into a combined administrative arrangement, so that you would have one office and one staff to serve each of the foundations, all really rooted in the Coca-Cola experience. The Whitehead, Joseph B. Whitehead, was one of the original bottlers of Coca-Cola, and he was from Chattanooga, an attorney from Chattanooga. He and Benjamin Thomas got the rights to bottle Coca-Cola over most of the United States from Asa Candler in 1899 for $1, perpetual contracts. And so Thomas and Whitehead went about the business of setting up Coca-Cola bottling franchises. Whitehead did not have much capital, so he brought in John Lupton, a Chattanooga businessman, and gave him 50% of his 50% of this bottling contract. Anyway, Whitehead's moved to Atlanta to set up the Atlanta Coca-Cola Bottling Company, and he died 3 years after they moved to Atlanta. They moved to Atlanta in 1903. He died in 1906. And then his widow and 2 minor children inherited his interest in the bottling operations, and they became wealthy because the bottling side of the business went well. And the widow, hired professional management to look after their interests. And so Mr. Woodruff took a strong interest in the Whitehead because it was so close tied to the Coca-Cola business. He put Mrs. Whitehead, she had remarried and became Lady Pate Evans, on the board of the Coca-Cola Company in the 1920s, one of the first women to ever serve on a national corporate board. And then she saw that Mr. Woodruff became a trustee of 2 of the family foundations. And it was the Whitehead, the 2 sons died without issue, without children. She then passed, and so Mr. Woodruff, being the leader that he was, and on the board of 2 of the foundations, had a lot of influence on what happened. And it was his idea that the foundations, both his own, which was a Trebor Foundation, and his mother and father's foundations, Emily and Ernest Woodruff, and the Whitehead, were brought together in a common administrative arrangement. And so Beaufort A. Jones was made president of each of the foundations, and then he asked me to come help him in the administration of the foundations. And so, and it was because of my experience of working with the Board of Trustees and with the president at Emory that introduced me to the foundation's experience, which really started a completely new and different era in 1972, because they all came together. Trebor Foundation eventually became the Robert W. Woodruff Foundation, which is the Woodruff Foundation of today. The Emily and Ernest Woodruff Foundation was given to Emory in 1979, all of it, by decision of the brothers George and Robert Woodruff, to simply place the mother and father's estate, which was in the foundation, just simply give that to Emory. So the Trebor Foundation became the Robert W. Woodruff Foundation. It is the Woodruff Foundation of today. And then you have the 3 Whitehead foundations that continue to exist, and they are now located in this building on 35th floor, still in that combined administrative arrangement. And I worked for Beaufort for 17 years, and held the positions of secretary, treasurer, vice president. And then when he retired in 1988, the trustees gave me the opportunity to succeed him as president. And I served as president for 18 years, and I was president of each of the foundations for 18 years. And then when I retired in 2007, then I became a trustee of the foundations. And so I have been involved with the Woodruff Foundation experience since beginning of 72 and until today.
My dad wanted me to ask you, he's always been really fascinated about the role that Buffalo Jones played in the poverty program here in Atlanta.
Yes.
So he wanted me to sort of ask you to talk what was the reasoning behind that?
Sure. Buffalo Jones had gone to Emory, and he had become Dean of Administration at Emory. He'd gone into service, but he came back. And he was Dean of Administration when Mr. Woodruff began to make investments in the medical school out there. Mr. Woodruff was concerned that Atlanta did not have an outstanding medical center. And when people in the community, his family, his friends became seriously ill, they had to go elsewhere. And so he felt like that Atlanta should have an outstanding medical center. And so he began to invest in the medical program at Emory, and Buffalo Jones is involved out there. And through that relationship, Buffalo Jones and Mr. Woodruff got to know one another. Buffalo was invited by President Kennedy to go to Washington and serve as a special assistant to the Secretary of HEW, and Buffalo's job would be in the medical area, and he sort of became the chief medical governmental officer in Washington, and he served in that capacity for 2 years under Kennedy, and then when Kennedy was assassinated, he continued to work for 2 years under President Johnson, or in President Johnson's administration. And so he was exposed to the programs that President Kennedy began to put in place, that sought to help people in poverty, let's just use that, to deal with the racial issues of the day, and the humanitarian concerns that the federal government began to take on a very serious manner. And then, of course, when the Great Society programs emerged in the Johnson administration, he was part of that. So he was integrally involved in what was taking place in both of those administrations. And in 1964, Mr. Woodruff invited Buffalo to come back to Atlanta and be president of the Emily and Ernest Woodruff Foundation, just that one foundation. And he did. He came back. So from 64 to 72, he was president. But it was from 64 to 72 and then beyond that Buffalo became involved with Economic Opportunity Atlanta, EOA. He was chairman of the board of the Department of Human Resources at the state level. And Buffalo would have to be considered one of the principal leaders within the white community to help lead the city through a lot of the changes, social changes that occurred at that time, and was one of the important bridges to the African American community from the white community. And one of the things, this is sort of my view on it, is that there was a generally positive set of relationships between the African American business community and the white business community And of course, at that time, in the early days, the white business community and the political community were pretty much the same. I mean, in other words, you had the white mayors and the white aldermen and so forth and so on. But there was a set of relationships that were positive. John Calhoun, Bill Calloway, Daddy King was involved in it, and I'll come back to that through my own Leadership Atlanta experience. And so there was communication, and folks got along reasonably well. And I'm going to say to you that in the time of transition, that Beausoleil was a very important factor in bridging providing a bridge between the white and the African American community at the times when tensions rose because of the interactions taking place, you know, around the struggle for civil rights, and was one of the reasons and one of the people that helped keep the community from becoming another. Birmingham was so bad, but where there were a lot of problems. But I would also like to say that Mr. Woodruff understood, these challenges very well himself. He was a man. He was not a churchman per se, but he's a very moral person, very principled person, and a person of good character. He was also head of a company where everybody was a customer. Everybody was a customer, and so therefore you should, whether it be in Atlanta, whether it be in Boston or Hattiesburg, or whether it be in Cape Town, South Africa, or wherever it might be, that everybody needed to be dealt with in the same fashion. And so, from a practical standpoint and I would say, moral and ethical standpoint, he was absolutely understood the importance of working out the matters pertaining to civil rights. And he was in President Johnson's office when Martin Luther King was shot, and he did make the call to Mary Allen, saying that Atlanta was going to become the center of the world, and that whatever it took to look after things well, to deal with it well, would be taken care of. And Tom Johnson was the person who delivered that note to President Johnson, and knew and can testify that that did occur that way. And but again, back to Beausoleil, and Mr. Woodruff did appreciate Beausoleil's his makeup, his abilities, his character, his morality, his vision for the community, and so he depended on Beausoleil, and so Beausoleil was a very, very important advisor to Mr. Woodruff on matters of the times, and particularly in regard to civil rights. So much of what the Coca-Cola Company did, what the foundation did at that time, was because of Beausoleil's influence on what occurred through Mr. Woodruff and through the work of the foundation. So Beausoleil, he just really, and he was willing to not only be the advisor, but to go to work on things like EOA and Department of Human Resources. where the rubber hit the road, so to speak. And he had extraordinary relationships with people I've mentioned, like Mr. Calhoun and as well as Jesse Hill and other leaders in the community, and Daddy King himself. And I remember I went through Leadership Atlanta in 1975, I think it was. And one of the things that my little group, not our whole class, but just our little subgroup, we went to Ebenezer, sat in the office of Dr. King, Daddy King, and we talked about these things. And I've got a tape of that conversation. And I've always sort of prided myself in talking directly about issues, and he and I got into it a little bit, and he said the word as we went through it. He said, "You know, kind of like you know," and I've got that, but I cannot find that tape. It's somewhere hidden in my stuff, and I'm going to find that, because that's one of the great treasures that I've got.
And you need to put it on digital.
Huh?
You need to put it on
digital. I do, but I need to find it first.
Yeah.
But I've got boxes of these tapes. Some of them don't have anything on them. Some of them have other things, and I'm still in search of it.
We're in the same mode of collecting these very carefully.
Yes, right.
Cataloging them and sorting them out so that we
mark them very carefully.
Yes.
Yes, and store them very carefully.
It's a little easier now with the whole digital thing, as long as that equipment doesn't change too much. That's the technology also gets over us.
Right.
So that's kind of an that's an interesting part, I think, of what's emerging in terms of the Atlanta way is that someone like Daddy King would sit and take time with the class and tell the stories and give people his feedback.
Right. And one of the things I would say about that is that he'd grown up in the segregated society, as so many of these business people. They had I don't know that accepted it, but that's what it was, and in their own way prospered in spite of it, and that struck me. Somebody like Daddy King was not consumed by anger over the circumstance, but rather had made the best of the life with education and with application. And in his case, it seemed to me that religion was the core of his being, and that the teaching and the preaching and the ministering through education was one of the essential elements of a successful society, segregated as it was at the time. You did have one of the points about there was the separation of the churches, and I don't say for at all that there was a close alliance between the white churches and the African American churches. I think there was give and take and some relationships, but in those, when I was here, the downtown churches of whatever the faith were the stronger churches, and the ministers of those churches were more involved in the matters of the community than the preachers of ministers of today. Better said, the downtown churches are not as strong as in terms of their positioning and their denomination as they were in those days, because Atlanta was a more centralized community. the Decatur was out there, but Marietta was very much of a. We didn't have the sort of conglomeration of the metropolitan area in the same way, and people lived closer to the downtown. They shopped downtown. Retail was downtown, not at Lenox Square, and so there was this convergence. And they went to church downtown: First Methodist, First Baptist, the Catholic churches, the Episcopal churches. I would say that the Episcopal churches are still strong downtown. I don't mean to demean them in the process, but there is a very real difference in this. And then, Harvey, you know, in Faith in the City, we dealt with a lot of this, and this transition that has taken place, and the difficulty to engage the faith community in the matters of the city, so to speak. Probably more successful in, well, there are a lot of the downtown churches that have a lot of community outreach, i.e. St. Luke's and what all that it's done in particular. And then, of course, I think the African American churches in various ways. But even there, your big, strong African American congregations are out in the super churches, non-denominational, independent, and they tend to be islands among themselves rather than connected. And that change in the faith community has been an important transition for Atlanta. That, quite frankly, we have not been successful. It has not helped us a lot. I think it has been a failure. And I mean, it's just occurred. It's occurred for very real reasons. But it's a shortcoming of the community this day and time.
Great. I guess we're three preacher's kids sitting around having this conversation.
Well, we understand we understand and appreciate the role of the church in the community, and I was just Kirby Godsey down at Mercer, Rittenborough, is God a Christian? And I was just before you came reading the foreword of it, and of course his position is that's not the point. Perhaps everybody has their own God in their own, and every faith has its own God, and we need to be respectful of one another, and we've gotten away from that by far. And that coming out of the Baptist church, I mean, he's particularly with the Southern Baptist orientation, he's not one of their favorite disciples at this point in time.
Mercer's been kind of on the liberal edge,
and will be, and I would say, fortunately, it is. A school like that, just like Emory, is not inclined to walk away from its spiritual roots, but that spirit is going to be interpreted very differently than and very broadly by comparison some of the churches, which is very narrow and exclusive in the process.
You've triggered an issue that I'd like to hear you speak to, and that's the role of Emory in the Atlanta community. A few of our conversations have touched on that, but you have a unique perspective, having been associated with Emory in the way that you were, and continuing connection through the foundation activity over a long period of time. How would you assess that role historically? How has it helped shape modern Atlanta?
Well, our educational institutions in Atlanta have to be considered one of its hallmarks, in Atlanta's hallmarks. I mean, we've got at AU Center, the largest concentration of African American higher education in the world. You've got the several institutions like Oglethorpe, Agnes Scott. What am I leaving out? Well, Emory, as part of that complex, Georgia Tech, Georgia State from the public side, and you got in and then all the I guess the community colleges would be added to that to complete the picture, and the Kennesaw States and the Clayton States. So add it all up, it's an extraordinary concentration of higher education. And Emory, as the Atlanta area has grown, and I'm going to say prospered, that the educational institutions have been a vital component of that. And Harvey, I see them more in the aggregate than I do in the individual parts. I'll come back to the individual, but I would say to you that what's happened at AU Center and what's happened as far as the growth and strength of Georgia Tech and Georgia State, been more difficult for Oglethorpe and Agnes Scott because they're private institutions and don't have the same resources available. And a place like Agnes Scott suffered the fact that it was a single gender institution, and that's sometimes been desired and sometimes not. And, I think they're doing okay now, but they would like to have more students, and they would like to have more paying students. And it's a challenge for all of private higher education. Anyhow, to find the resources necessary to maintain the systems in place. All right, so Atlanta, one of the reasons Atlanta has prospered is because of the presence and growth of these educational institutions of higher learning. And they are distinctive in almost every instance. Emory has played an important role in that it is a private co-educational liberal arts institution with programs, professional programs in law and theology and business and public health, and then that gets into the medical area. The medical area, medical components of Emory represent 80% of the institution. And so you can't speak about Emory's presence without referring to the very strong role it plays in the medical experience, medical education, medical research, and medical and health service in the community, particularly in Midtown Hospital and Emory University Hospital, and now St. Joseph's is 51% Emory, and other programs in the community. So and then don't leave out Grady, and the fact that Emory has provided the principal professional services at Grady. Morehouse is now included in that. But Grady has been successful in terms of the good care that has been given there. Challenged economically, but you've always been able to get good care at Grady because of Emory's presence there. And Grady is considered one of the best teaching hospitals in the country. And now Grady, with the investments that Bernie Marcus making and Pete Carell and others, as well as Woodruff Foundation, Grady is prospering in terms of what it is capable of doing. And it still struggles to find enough money to beat the basic operating costs. But if you have a stroke, you want to go to Grady. If you have an emergency problem, you want to go to Grady. And there, more of that is going to unfold, I think, over the times ahead. But Emory has played an important role in that service. So Harvey, a very extraordinary contribution that Emory has made has been to the well-being, health-wise, of our community. There is also the let's call it the moral and ethical side, and the theology school, and so it has produced a lot of leaders in the faith community most, I would say, of the ministers that you'll find at the Methodist churches around Atlanta and around the region are, come out of the largest Methodist seminary in the world. Except that it's not, just doesn't focus on Methodism. You've got the Jewish program, you got the Baptist program out there, you got the Episcopal program, and so forth and so on. Catholic, Aquinas Center. It has a very strong ecumenical. But there is that, and I would say to you that out of the university too has come a lot of the moral and ethical thinking of the community that has come from those who have been on the faculty and come and be part of the university. But in terms of overall educational experience, it's been one part of the overall complex or aggregate of educational institutions in the community.
I think one of the things we've been extraordinarily impressed with is the role of higher education as magnet, first to the state and then the region, and now increasingly nationally and internationally.
Right.
To bring talent here. And we've interviewed ever so many people who came here to go to school, white and black, who stayed. Correct. Once they found opportunity.
Enormous benefit, and the overall health of the community. They came, they had successful experience at the educational institution, and they enjoyed. They found promise, and they found acceptance. One of the things I would say about Atlanta is from its beginning as a railroad town, it's been an open community that people can come from all over and find a place that is welcoming, that is not drastically narrow. I won't say totally, but drastically narrow. It's more of an open community than any kind of a closed community. You don't get the feel that whether white or African American, that somehow you're excluded because you didn't grow up here or something like that. In fact, most of the community didn't come from here, and so that is an important element to I think Atlanta's success and its continued being. It's been an open community as far as business and commerce. That's important, and we continue to work to try to attract more. Our educational institutions are an important part of that. I had meetings this morning, in regard to how can we do things more capably in letting the world know what is here and the advantages of what we have. And one of the ways to talk about that is to look at the past. Is that let's go back to the point of Emory. Emory had been given by Mr. Woodruff money to buy land on Clifton Road, which, when the idea of establishing the Centers for Disease Control was advanced many years ago, then Emory offered the land to the federal government to build the CDC. It took 10 years to build the building up, and it took Mr. Woodruff's intervention with President Eisenhower to get that building process underway. But the establishment of CDC here was because of Emory's presence and because of Mr. Woodruff's investment in Emory and interest in seeing, and that has a long history that we'd run out of tape on that as far as how malaria was the beginning of that, and that program was located in Atlanta well before CDC, and it was out of that malaria control program that CDC grew and was established, became established here in Atlanta. But that, and then you had care. One of the things we did in the Woodrow Foundation was to invest in the uplifting of the community by helping to attract organizations like CARE. When we found out that CARE was interested in moving out of Manhattan because of the cost of doing business in Manhattan, Woodrow Foundation made sure that CARE understood that the welcome would be warm in Atlanta. Now, the airport and the ability to move around the world from Atlanta is central to so much of what takes place from a lot of standpoint, not the least of which is organizations like CARE and CDC, but also businesses. But Woodrow Foundation provided the money to help get them established in their building down there, and we did the same thing for the American Cancer Society. Beauflay was principal in seeing that happened, and organizations like Boys and Girls Clubs of America. Mr. Woodruff had been on that board, and they decided they would leave Manhattan, and so we made sure that they pretty well bought the building that they were in on West Peachtree, and now they're on Peachtree Street, and we've helped with that building. So I call that entrepreneurial philanthropy, community focused, so that the community is enhanced by the presence of these very important organizations who come to call Atlanta their national home, if not international home. Habitat for Humanity International here, and you can go on and on. And those things have been important to Atlanta's progress and to its well-being, helping to define it as a community that does have a community sense, a moral sense, and a service sense. I mean, you can consider Atlanta the public health capital of the world, global health capital of the world. Got task force for global health located out in Decatur. It's third or fourth largest charity in the country in terms of revenues, because the pharmaceutical companies channel so much of their giving of medications for various diseases through that organization. And not well known, but it's Task Force for Global Health. Task Force for Global Health. Dr. Mark Rosenberg is president of that organization. It really, it was established by Bill Foege, who used to be head of CDC and understood how an organization like that could benefit from, as a conduit for that. Then you've got the Carter Center with its many interests, particularly, of course, its World Health activities. And you put all that together, and we are, the sort of center point for global health. And one of the things that we're working on now is the definition of it, of Atlanta being a place where in the healthcare sector it goes from discovery, research, institution to delivery. Public health from discovery to delivery.
I think our president at Georgia State very much wants to be in that.
Wants to be a part of the conversation.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's a multi-institutional approach.
I think there was something recently in the Business Chronicle.
That's correct. That is correct. And Dr. Rosenberg and Dr. Foege were featured in that article.
There are a lot of people thinking about how this can be accomplished. In my lunch conversation yesterday with Emery Morseberger, he was trying to figure out if he could play a role in connecting all of this with space in the Ponce de Leon City Hall East building, that sort of thing.
Sure.
I'm sure he's talked to you about the Medici Center.
For many years. But Emory is one of those people that thinks about things in larger terms than the average person. Most of us are hemmed in by what we see the practical limitation. Emory doesn't quite think that way. He tries to dream about these others, some of which are really out in space. But I appreciate Emory very much because he does think that way, and he doesn't think of it in terms of a personal benefit. Some of that's included because he was an investor in City Hall East and so forth, but he thinks of it in larger terms than that. And so you need the dreamers. For sure you need the dreamers.
Yeah, I keep talking to him about Medici Center and the brain train.
Yeah.
That are two of his big dreams.
That's correct. That's right.
If either ever happens, it'll be because he made it happen.
Yeah. He'll be a pusher, let's put it that way. Yeah.
And all I can do is think of why it won't work. The obstacles to cooperation.
Right.
He looks at a map and he sees all these institutions and their need to cooperate, and how the synergy that might be possible between all the higher education institutions and the health-related,
Right.
energy, sustainability, all those overlapping things. It's a great vision.
Right.
It's a great vision. To go back to the 50s, 60s, when did you first hear the term to describe Atlanta as the city too busy to hate? We have not been able to get a fix on who coined that.
I can't nail it down.
Was it Mayor Hartsfield
I think
who
it
used
was.
it?
I think it was.
Or Helen,
Well, my dad's theory is that Hartsfield used it. It was coined by
Helen Bullard.
Bullard for him.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at that at all.
Mm-hmm.
And it's extraordinary what role she played in a lot of the thinking about what he did and others did, coming out of that context of people who, hey, you know, we need to be concerned about the well-being of the entire community. But I can't answer your question direct because I don't know the answer to that. But I believe it's exactly what you say.
he certainly embraced it.
Oh yeah.
And never gave a speech without it
Right.
after that time.
And Mayor Allen, you know, would follow right into that same context. Of course, Mayor Allen is such a strong leader for us, icon, because of what he did, you know, in terms of the civil rights experience. And and he was, of course, very good friends with Mr. Woodruff, a member of the Woodruff Foundation board, a person I had a very close relationship with and cherish so much. I helped carry his casket to the grave, so I have enormously strong feelings about the role of Ivan Allen. I didn't know Mayor Hartsfield like I knew.
And how do you think he came to play the role that he did? Because it's so singular in terms of the leaders of southern cities at that time.
Well, I think that he and others, like Beausoleil, and I'm going to say Mr. Woodruff and others, had a larger vision, as a larger concept of what the thinking and actions of the community should be in dealing with the matters, you know, and the principal issues, race. And so it was their determination, their conclusion and their determination that Atlanta could be different. And they worked to achieve that. So there was a collection of leaders, you know, at that time that believed that way and acted that way and helped us through it all. and who reached out as well as they could, you know, to the African American community to make it.
Well, and I think that's one of the other things that really distinguished Atlanta, because I mean, my dad talks about being places where, you know, it was you just couldn't even get anybody to meet with you know. And in Atlanta, you know, I mean, Ivan Allen, you know, went to the African American group that was sponsoring the United Way. What was the predecessor of the United Way's event?
Community Chest.
Community Chest, and you know, the Action Forum.
Right. Actually, yep.
That they're just, you know, the decision to accept, I guess, Herman Russell into the Commerce Club, and just other places that just didn't. Right. Just wasn't conceivable.
You know, I think that's exactly right in this determination for that. The Action Forum does need to be raised up as one of the very valuable organized efforts to bring folks together, so there could be meaningful dialogue, and then a place where the issues could be talked about and resolved as well as possible. So that was a very important initiative by both the African American leadership and the Caucasian leadership, white leadership in the community, which was principally business oriented, not so much politically oriented, although it did become a place where the political interface began to take place.
One of the defining characteristics of the Atlanta Way that you've alluded to in your comments as well is the commitment of business leaders to the well-being of the city. Why were Atlanta business leaders so invested in Atlanta?
Well, I think it goes back to the establishment of a tradition that goes back even before Mr. Woodruff. People like, you know, Joel Hurt was the one that brought Mr. Woodruff and his family, Ernest Woodruff, from Columbus. Robert Woodruff, born in Columbus, in the grain business town there, his father was, and Joel Hurt married Ernest Woodruff's sister, and that led to Joel Hurt bringing Ernest Woodruff to Atlanta to have Mr. Ernest Woodruff look after some of Mr. Hurt's business activities, including the Trust Company of Georgia, and Mr. Ernest Woodruff became the chairman of that board, and that syndicate headed up the syndicate that bought the Coca-Cola Company in 1919. But I think prior to that, you had, again, an open community that was very ambitious commercially, very commercially ambitious. And there was good reason for it to be optimistic about that because of the railroads, the junction here, that's, you know, very important. And then the airport came later, but the railroads were the central benefit in the early days. And I think that there was an order established, early part of last century, whereby Atlanta business community could prosper through cooperation and I think through working together. I would say to you that the Chamber of Commerce has had a long history of reaching out to drawing in business leadership to work on the common issues, community issues of the day, including, trying to make commercial activity more successful, but the whole matter of working together. So a tradition was established, way back among the business leaders, and I think you will find that this was also true among the African American business leaders. And I would say to you that, in particular in that case, that there was the close connection with the church. And I do believe, if I go back to what I said about the role of the churches in Atlanta's, social and political life, when it was a different community than it is today, that those, faith representatives helped influence the concern for a broader well-being in the community than just the self-interest of business. But even today, you have what's changed so much about Atlanta today is that back in the 50s and before, you had in the 60s, it began to change. I would say in the 70s, that most of the business activity was led by the owners of those businesses. They lived here. This was their community. And so they wanted to have a prosperous community, but they also wanted to have a healthy community. And so those owners banded together to work together to, try to have in office, political leaders that were progressive, and then to have things about the community, which is to invest in the airport, make it what it is, which is so huge, as I've said before. So those people who had grown up in Atlanta, who were the owners of the Richard Rich, or the law firms were all made up of people here in Atlanta, the audit firms and the banks and the Mills Lanes and others, but you just go on down the list, and of course the Coca-Cola Company. That they were doing it, but now it's hard to find any people who head up these organizations that are from Atlanta, and it's hard to find any of those organizations that are principally of Atlanta. The largest law firms, there are more partners outside of Atlanta than there are inside of Atlanta, whether it be King & Spalding, Alston & Bird, wherever you want to go. Coca-Cola Company is headed up by a Turk, and who didn't grow up in Atlanta. The banks, only as far as large banks, only SunTrust is considered, to be a hometown bank. But you look at the management, and you're going to find folks from all over. And the other banks, they're either controlled out of Charlotte or New York or someplace, or Canada or someplace else. So there's been this great transition from of leadership who were of Atlanta to those who are in Atlanta, to sort of use a little shorthand in that, and that makes a big difference. But what I also say is that because of the tradition of leadership, such as at the Chamber of Commerce, Leadership Atlanta, and just go right down the list of different ways in which people are involved in the community, this tradition has been an expectation. It's more than tradition, it's an expectation. And it has become integrated. The genders, they're much, Carol Tomei of Home Depot heading up the chamber at this point in time. And so there has been this evolution, but there still is an expectation and a resulting commitment from leadership, business leadership, to be concerned about the issues. United Way, that its success is always dependent upon the investment of business leadership, Got people like John Somerhalder, who heads up the AGL Resources, who was willing to serve as chair of United Way for 2 years instead of just 1 year. and so here's John from Texas coming in and being an important. Now he's heading the Beltline Partnership, and so these transplants do become involved. And I say they become involved because they're drawn into this tradition and to this expectation.
Do you think this continuation of the tradition bodes well for the future of the Atlanta Way?
I believe that to be the case. You know, it renews itself. It's proven that over the years. It's different, as I have pointed out, and it's more difficult. And in many cases, these people will serve, but for a limited period of times, and then they're off. They may go someplace else. Whereas again, before they stayed here, this was home. And yes, but it is more difficult in part because the community continues to grow, and we have this problem of fragmentation of government. We've got this large metropolitan area spread among all these counties and all these municipalities, and each one thinks differently in some way or another, and too often anti-Atlanta for whatever reason. And so we've got a challenge in that regard. And Atlanta is, the Atlanta Regional Commission is an important planning process, but it has no real governmental teeth. And so there's nothing, you've got this metropolitan area, the only thing that really where you can manage is going to be at the state level. And you still have at the state level fairly strong outside Atlanta influence. I guess you could say rural, but that's, you know, Columbus is not rural and Savannah is not rural, and so you've got that fragmentation, and there's a distinctive different set of differences there, you know, within the state experience. But at some point in time, there's got to be a realization that so goes Atlanta, so goes the rest of the state, and that a greater commitment on the part of the state to the well-being. Now that takes cooperation on the local level too for that to occur. So there's got to be a greater coming together of the state process, which is a political process, and the local process. Unfortunately, it is hung on the same bad hooks that we are hung up on national level, is that the sharp divide, you know, conservative, liberal, and, you know, Democrat, Republican, and those differences are so markedly separate. This day and time, great national challenge. We're faced with that on the local and the state level as well, and we have precious few leaders, political leaders, who think in terms of what's good for everybody and not just this particular political or social orientation. And you've got people that leave in Congress because of that. And so we've got to somehow, this country and this state and our local communities have got to find a way to be more balanced and inclusive, and in what we do in building and maintaining our communities. It comes from leadership, and so hopefully there are leaders out there who want that and who will offer. But there's so many good people who won't offer today because of the difficulties that they will face.
No good deed goes unpunished.
You got it. You got it. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
I've really, seen the change in the tone.
Yeah. Redistricting has had a lot to do with it, so that people, organized in such a way that they sort of think this way, and you don't have those people who have to appeal to a broader context.
Well, what's your perspective on poverty in Atlanta? It's one of the I guess criticisms of sort of Atlanta's growth and accomplishment that we have people who are prospering incredibly here of all races, but yet we have this persistent poverty population.
It's the problem of the world, and it's a problem of the nation. It's a problem in Atlanta. We do try to reach out to everyone to educate. We do, that's one thing we make people do, is go to school when they're children, and so the effort to try to educate, I think, is commendable, and we need to invest as much as we possibly can in that process, starting as early as we can, so that individuals have the opportunity, and certainly as we know it today, that the ability to have a job this day and time depends upon your intellectual capability more than just your physical capability. And you do need to know how to read and write. You do need to know how to communicate. So that educational process is so very, very important. But too many people are falling out of that, in particular, of course, in the African American community. Too many people are falling out. Too many are falling into crime, and that is a swinging door, revolving door process, whereby they're incarcerated, and then they're still we're not able to do much of rehabilitating folks in the prison process, so they come out, and just as I say, a revolving door. So we're poverty. We have different ways we reach out to try to help people. We've got food stamps, we've got the food bank, we've got public housing, we've got Grady Hospital. There are ways in which the society seeks to reach out and serve. And we've got the Pell Grants in terms of education and so forth. There are ways in which the nation and the state and the local community does try to reach out to the poor, but for the most part, it's an economic circumstance that the matter of poverty, and so how we get out of that, I think, is back to the point of how well we can do from an economic standpoint, and how well we can educate as many of our citizens as we can, and encourage them to be involved in gainful employment, and to not see crime as an avenue, as a substitute to it. But where we are, there are people in poverty right now. What are we going to do about them? We do have to try to, and we worked hard on the homeless issue in Atlanta, and the intention was to eliminate homelessness in 10 years. It's unrealistic, because we're not making the kind of progress that eliminates the problem. But we do have to have outreach, and have to try to serve people, to look after people, to look after children, little children and children who are in the streets. Too much of what's happening in the lives of children are is the instructions found in the streets, and the access that the street culture has to children, is often greater than some children than it is the other way around. It's a cycle that keeps repeating itself, and we've got to reach out as strongly as we possibly can through early childhood nurturing, education, and then, we've got to have an economic experience that allows a person who does go and become educated and who is law-abiding to be able to be employed and to be able to not be in poverty, and hopefully to be involved in a good nuclear family that brings about the qualities of life that most people aspire to. So we have to make a strong commitment to trying to reach out to people that are in need today, and to prepare the young that are coming along, and to the extent we can to adults today, that they can have opportunity. But it does take a desire on the part of the individual to improve themselves, and we've got to create a climate whereby that is encouraged, and when it does occur, that we are able to fulfill that opportunity. But poverty in Atlanta is just, again, it's a matter that repeats itself all over this country and all over the world. One of the things that's happened in Atlanta is, and it happened across this country, and particularly in the South, is the influx of the Latino population that have come to take jobs. That means that others are not able to do those jobs, and whole industries have been taken over by, in terms of those who do the work, by the Latino population, and which is having and going to have tremendous impact on the future of this country as you go forward.
Not to be too academic here, but her dad is recommending a book by Jim Clifton, The Coming Jobs War.
I think I've heard.
He made me read it. I recommend it.
All right.
Really good. Clifton is head of the Gallup organization, and he's thinking about the number of jobs that are needed throughout the world.
Right.
And how cities have to play the critical role of being the place where those jobs are created. And it's a fascinating argument, one that's obviously important for the way that I think about things.
Poverty and the success, the economic advancement go together. You can't separate the two, because government simply cannot solve the problems of poverty without some kind of economic prosperity, and it's a very complicated formula, as you know. I happen to disagree with that to some extent, because of what has begun to happen in terms of food. Our agricultural community is doing a lot better today than it was doing 25 years ago. I think that I think there can be more opportunity out in the rural areas than we recognize, so I don't think we have a handle yet on how we can, in a very intentional manner, begin to look at that and work at that in ways in which there can be more economic opportunity across the landscape.
It's been a challenge in Georgia
Yeah.
and Egypt, everywhere else.
Right.
Yeah, and it's what they say in their global polling is that the number one concern people have now is a job, a quality job, and it's hard to disagree that that's a really important asset.
Yeah. Well, that comes with the development of society and where people want to be in that society. And that produces an even greater challenge. I guess my thought about what can happen in the rural landscape argues against that, but maybe not, because having lived out among that over all my so much of my life, there's so many good qualities to that. People are closer. Community. You talk about village raising a child. That's where it really worked. Because everybody knew you, and if you, particularly preacher's son, stepped out of line, you're gonna know about it,
Right.
and not and your parents are gonna hear about it. So I'm a one who appreciates the life experience beyond the city. Appreciates it very, very much, and know that there can be excellent educational systems in those rural areas, as long as there's some kind of economic base to help. And what I'm saying is that given our the demand for food, our ability to produce food and to do it well, and it's not just look, with the whole immigration issue. Saxby Chambliss was against immigration change until he found out that most of his so much of his constituency depended on those people to gather the products. Now that's at the low end. I understand that, but I think what I'm saying is it can go up beyond that. It can go up beyond that.
Well, I guess one of the things we're trying to get a handle on is whether or not the poverty in Atlanta is the same people persisting in poverty over time, or sort of a churning where people are attracted to Atlanta because of the opportunity, and you have and as with and because of so much of Atlanta's growth has been in the suburbs, that in terms of the city, the poverty is sort of reflected of kind of folks attracted to the city, rather than what happened here failing the people who grew up here.
It's both. It's both. You have some of both. The cycle, local, and then you have those who come from other places. I mean, Katrina, so many people came from New Orleans, so you have that influx, and you do have, particularly in the African American side, the Atlanta seen as a very positive place to be, so it's both. Now, one of the things that's happened is Atlanta has grown. Atlanta in the metropolitan sense. A lot of the poverty, as we know it, it's spread itself out into the other communities, other counties. And one of the things that, when the public housing was changed to more of a mixed income, where and Section 8, so much so many of those people went into Clayton County and went into Cobb County and went into Douglas County and so forth. So, but that's what I'm going to say, that's part of that cycle of those who are behind, can't get things going. It's both. People do come, and I'm also going to say that part of your Latino growth, that particularly as the jobs that they were coming to try to fill, as they are no longer there to be filled, then so many of them are falling into the category of poverty. And so it is immigration, I mean migration, that's what I'm saying, migration in, but it's also a recycling of those that have been here and have not been able to succeed. It's a combination of the two. But it has spread itself more broadly geographically in our experience. It's not just the city of Atlanta.
One of the things that's obviously a focus of this project is Ambassador Young's role in the shaping of Atlanta.
Sure.
What would you comment on in regard to Andrew Young? We haven't asked you that.
Right. Well, he is who he is, a man of faith, a man who played a central role in civil rights evolution. A man of the community who, has been a constant. And those constants are very important. The Woodruff Foundation is a constant. It's something that is there to be applied. And he has been a constant. So, and it's been over Martin Luther King Jr. gone. So that, and so Dr. Young has been an influence in the core character of this community, with a style that is firm but not confrontational, one that speaks to the higher principles and values. Even though he was involved in the political process as mayor, as congressman, you look back on those experiences not with a sharpness of political positioning, but more of a community-focused agenda and orientation. And I think he's been greatly respected for that and for the faith that he continues to exercise in who he is and what he does. Because of his UN experience and just simply the way he has become, yes, an icon. What's an icon? Icon is a symbol of something, and it's a symbol of goodness and caring for everybody, and so that influence has been extremely beneficial as this constant in our community to help us along, and he stays involved. I mean, he's generally available to whoever calls on him, and he's, I mean, one of the most amazing people I've ever seen, who could walk in the door without one single note, stand up there and speak for about an hour or two, and say, everything is well organized and it's strong and to the point. He's extremely capable, person, extremely capable leader who has very carefully chosen not to narrow himself through some kind of particular political or so whatever it is. I mean, he's a man of the broader community. He understands the business side of things, and he would be one that wanted to see business prosper. Does, and as I measured, he's got a little business of his own, and so it's okay, and that's the way it should be. And so he's had enormous influence on the continued transition of the Atlanta experience, but his influence is by no means limited to Atlanta, but he's been an important part of the fabric of what has been woven in Atlanta because of who he is, what he went through, and then what he represents.
Beautifully stated.
Off the top of the head, but educated from the standpoint of having seen it, through all of this, not all of it, but seen much of it.
Do you have other?
Well, I guess my only is how you would summarize the Atlanta way. What would you say is the best, the Atlanta way in its best sense?
Well, I think the Atlanta way continues to be one to seek the best prosperity, prosperity includes having good educational programs, good health programs, good social programs, and to be Atlanta has an ambition to be a leader, and it has been a leader in the South. It has been a good example for the South, better than I think any community can claim, any large community can claim in the South on many fronts. And so that ambition is fundamental to the Atlanta way. I think the Atlanta way does seek, whether it actually accomplishes is another matter, seeks to do it in a multicultural fashion, and that it does expect people in the community to be committed to a concern for everybody, and that we work together and do things together. I pointed out ways in which that's very difficult to do, not the least of which is the fragmentation of our governments and communities. And I do think that it does have a spiritual bearing, and that spiritual bearing has a historical origin, and I think it has contemporary bearings because of the influence of people like Andy Young in what is taking place. I think the Atlanta way does incorporate a strong focus on back to education, and in this instance I'm talking about higher education, and the fact that we want to be about the process of educating some of the strongest and finest and most capable people that our institutions can produce, and that we have a want to be a part of the world, not just the South. We want to be a player in world affairs. And, so every time that Japan Airlines comes in, Lufthansa, whatever plane comes into the airport, that's just a personification of what I'm talking about, of our ability to do that.
I want to say thank you very much for for your willingness to sit down with us, put your thoughts on the record. You've given us some great insight into this city, where it has been, and equally important, where it is now and where it's going.
Well, you're welcome, and I hope it was helpful. I do think a lot about, and have for a long time, thought about the role of the Woodruff Foundation in that regard, and so much of what I've said comes out of that reference of trying to make sure that the Woodruff Foundation played the role that it should in terms of advancement of the community. We get criticized sometimes because we don't follow every idea, and I think about Emory Morseberger in that regard. But there are other ideas. But things have got to be feasible. They've got to be things that where you have the leadership in place, you have a commitment large enough the community for it to take place, and that thing can be successful from an economic standpoint. But institutions like, and I would come back to the point that the Atlanta Way does include philanthropy, whether it be Woodruff, whether it be Bernie Marcus, whether it be an Arthur Blank, whether it be Tyler Perry. And Tyler has, I think, I mean, in the broader community, and so giving is a part of the core fabric of the community, and the largest, of course, have been Mr. Woodruff himself, and we all, certainly involved in the family, stand behind him and his example. It's really kind of easy for us to know what to do because he taught us what to do. He cared about the community, invested in the community. He didn't try to tell the community what to do. He depended upon people to advise him in that regard, and he depended on others to carry out. But he would choose those that he believed were committed, capable, and dedicated to what was sought to be accomplished.
Well, just looking back in the 40 plus years that I've been here, obviously Georgia State has changed, and I've had a ringside seat to watch that. But when I came here to Emory, I thought it was a very provincial institution.
Nice school.
And I'm talking about Emory.
Oh, Emory, excuse me. Yeah.
And I came here to do a PhD at Emory.
Yeah.
That's what brought me to Atlanta.
Right.
And I had come from Duke. Duke had better resources, better
Right.
library. And Mr. Woodruff's generosity to Emory in the 70s transformed that institution in some extraordinary ways.
Right.
You and I were talking about it this week when they acquired the Hartford Seminary collection in the theology holdings.
Right.
That put Emory on the world map in terms of theological research,
Right.
which it hadn't had before.
Right. But Harvey, let me quickly correct you, is that Mr. Woodruff didn't do that. Leadership at Emory did it. And I lift up Jim Laney as being in the position to recognize, for instance, at Hartford Seminary, having all the incunabula and having that tremendous special collection at Emory would be something of great value. But the transition of Emory, and this is true of any of the institutions, is all dependent upon if we didn't do anything at the foundation, if Mr. Woodruff did anything, they invested in leadership, and the quality of that leadership was what you were looking at and looking for, because you invest in people. You don't invest in institutions, you invest in people. Institutions are people. And so it was Jim Laney that said we need to do, and he ended up with some money that he could make some important changes by going after top faculty, by going after top students, by implementing programs that were meaningful.
I tease him about, he was my first point of contact with him. Before I came down and visited the school,
Right.
I went to hear him speak in North Carolina.
Right.
And that night after the speech, I shook hands with him. I said, I've been accepted to Emory. And he said, you come see me when you arrive.
Right.
And so he was dean of the theology school at the time. And I went into his office, shook his hand, and he remembered the night, called me by name.
Right.
Remembered that night that he had met me in Louis Creek, North Carolina,
Right.
of all places. But that was just the kind of leader that he was.
Yeah. Okay.
And he and your dad had a remarkable partnership.
Oh yeah. Well, and I saw this in Faith in the City,
Yeah.
for over the many years. A rich experience for me.
It
All right.
certainly was.
This is really great. We really appreciate your time and
Sure.
your insights and your kind words about my dad.